Hello everyone and welcome to my Nutrient Nirvana channel. As any regular viewer of my channel will know, we focus mainly on health related subjects, but we occasionally like to step outside of the world of health and explore other areas of interest like ancient history, megaliths and other unsolved mysteries. Well, today is one of those videos. My guest today is Ellis, an amazing researcher and author of 10 books on biblical history. In this video, we will focus in on 3 of those books: Cleopatra to Christ, King Jesus, and Jesus, King of Edessa. So, who was the historical Jesus Christ? Did he even exist? Can we find him in the historical record? Well, I know a man who can. Ellis, welcome to Nutrient Nirvana.
Thanks for having me on the show, Paul. Good to be with you.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure. So, Ralph, where do we kick off with this story? Do we kick it off with the nativity scene?
We could do, but we could also start with why I thought there was a problem in the first place.
Brilliant.
We have believers, and we've had believers for 2,000 years, and I was never one of them. So what was the problem with the story they are giving us? And the primary difficulty is that all of these famous people who have influenced civilization down through 2 millennia cannot be found in the historical record. There is a problem here. We have this story, and most of our stories we have from history, even some of the mythological ones, we can find traces of that story within the historical record. But this one, we cannot. Apart from a few mentions, of Pontius Pilate and maybe, a few of the emperors of Rome and so on, most of the people cannot be found in the historical record. And that's the problem. Why should we believe this story when these characters are not readily visible? And how did they become deleted? I mean, if these were real characters, how did they become deleted from the historical record? You've only got a couple of choices here. Either this is all mythological, which some people, the mythologists will say because, well, quite rightly, they cannot find these characters in the historical record, therefore it is all mythological. Or you say, well, we have the book, just believe it. Neither position is very satisfactory. We really need to have a deeper look at this to see why this story became so famous and why these people still cannot be found in the historical record despite their being so apparently so famous at the time in the 1st century. How did we lose them from the historical record? Well, I started this back in 97, I think, with my first book, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, which was looking actually at the same problem that we have in the Old Testament, because again, we have all of these famous characters in the Old Testament, and they're not visible in the historical record either. So I started with them and found those people in the historical record, and we can go through that maybe in a later talk, by looking into the history of Egypt. And then we come down to the New Testament, and of course that's connected with Egypt as well, because out of Egypt I have called my son. Jesus was something to do with Egypt. He spent his whole of his education there in Egypt. He was known as the Egyptian false prophet in the works of Acts of the Apostles and of Josephus Flavius, so he was something to do with Egypt. Why can't we find these people in the historical record? How do we go about finding them in the historical record? Well, it actually took about 20 years before I managed to get there, but I found many pointers along the way. And the first pointer I found was the identity of Saul. So Saul, St. Paul, is the guy who wrote most of the gospel story, and he appears to have had influences on Luke and Acts as well. A lot of Acts is written in the first person, as if it's Saul actually dictating this story. Um, who is he? Now, here's another guy that is missing from the historical record. I mean, this is the guy that created Christianity. And again, we can't find him. Many Christians are a bit confused on this. Christianity doesn't come from Jesus. It has nothing to do with Jesus. Jesus was a Nazarene Jew. He was not a Christian. Christianity came from the Church of Saul. For those not familiar with the story, Jesus was a Nazarene Jew. He was preaching to the Jews, and Saul went out on his first evangelical tour and was preaching to the Jews about this new Nazarene Judaism, which I call Egypto-Judaism, because it's not like standard Judaism. And they weren't terribly interested, but the Gentiles were. And so Saul went to James, the brother of Jesus, and said, look, can I go and preach to these Gentiles, because they seem to be interested in this? And for whatever reasons, James said yes. And so on his second evangelical tour, he went out and he was preaching to the Gentiles because they were interested in this story. And the story actually at that time was not really the story of Jesus, although he was the sort of leader of the sect, leader of that community. This was mainly about astrology. So the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James, their primary symbol is the zodiac.
Wow.
And again, you won't be told that because, well, the church won't tell you, the Jews won't tell you, historians won't tell you. But of the early synagogues in Judea and in Syria and in modern Jordan, 8 synagogues have been found, and they all have a zodiac on the floor.
Wow. Could I just say, doesn't the greeting Mazel Tov, doesn't that mean good stars, good constellation?
Yes, good constellation. The famous greeting in Judaism is good constellation, inferring good prophecy, because of course these zodiacs and constellations were used for prophecy. And so they're saying good fortune, but fortune via astrology. So yes, all of these early synagogues have a huge mosaic of a zodiac on the floor. And so we know that astrology was the primary symbol of Nazarene Judaism, not necessarily astrology, not necessarily the Judaism of the temple. This was a new sect, which was called the 4th sect of Judaism by Josephus, which had arisen in the 1st century. Originally, it was formed by Judas the Galilean, Judas of Galilee, and then by who I say what he was, his son, which was Jesus of Galilee, Jesus the Galilean, Jesus of Gamala. And so there was this difference between these two churches. So we had the Nazarene church interested in an astrology, and then we had the church of Saul, St. Paul, which was preaching to the Gentiles. Now, he didn't know so much about astrology because he had never been initiated into the depths of this particular Nazarene sect. But the Gentiles were interested in this story and got more and more powerful until the church of Saul became more powerful than the Nazarene church of Jesus and James. Now, what Christianity is it was derived from Saul. So Christians are following, because these two churches became enemies of each other. They were at each other's throats. Christians are following the religion of the enemy of Jesus.
Wow.
So they are anti-Jesus, most Christians, because they're following the wrong religion. They're following the Gentile religion of Saul, who became the apostle to the Gentiles.
So what happened to the religion of Jesus and James?
It virtually was extinguished. So when you hear of the persecutions, and there were persecutions by the Romans, the persecutions were not against the church of Saul, what I call simple Judaism, Christianity. The persecutions were against the Nazarene church of Jesus and James, which was a messianic religion that was fomenting disputes and revolts in the east of the Roman Empire, and the Romans didn't want that, and that was the persecution that you hear about. Meanwhile, Christianity, simple Judaism, was getting a free ride courtesy of the Flavian emperors, because it was a Rome-friendly form of Judaism that Rome approved of. It said, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. It said, turn the other cheek. It said, obey what the emperor says, because your leaders are appointed by God, therefore you must obey the emperor. It's perfect, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's exactly what Rome ordered. So that is the background to how Christianity arrived, but we still haven't answered the problem as to whether this was based on mythology, whether this story was made up by Saul, or whether there was a real history behind it. And I found a real history, but it took a lot of digging to find it. And the first way in which I found it was this comparison, this identification of who Saul was. And it seemed pretty obvious the first time I even went into this in any depth that Saul was Josephus Flavius.
Okay.
The historian, the first century historian of Judea, from whom we get all of this information, from whom influenced the works of Luke and Acts, are full of quotations and extracts from the works of Josephus.
I was going to say, because considering Saul is such a major figure in all of this, there's actually very little information on him.
We know nothing about Saul. So again, we have one of these very, very famous characters, the guy who created Christianity, and we have no information on him whatsoever. Again, strange situation. However, if we look at the life of Josephus Flavius, we find that there are many links between these two characters, including the fact that they were both on the same prison ship going to Rome. So in AD 62, both Saul and Josephus were sent on a prison ship from Judea, which went across to Cyprus, picked up another boat, and was caught in a storm, a 3-day major storm in the Mediterranean, and it was dashed to pieces on Malta. And both of these characters were on this ship, and both of these characters were then sailed to Naples and went to Rome to see Nero, and both of them went to see Nero. Okay, now is this two people, or is this just one person with two names? For many, many reasons, and I go through quite a lot of the reasons in my books. This is in my, well, it was first in my Jesus Last of the Pharaohs, where I just included it as one chapter. But then I went through it again in King Jesus, and I made a whole book on this topic, because this is an essential pillar on finding the Gospel Jesus, because you cannot find the Gospel Jesus unless you can find the guy who wrote the texts. And of course, Saul is one of the primary figures who wrote these texts. And it seems likely, certain, that he is Josephus Flavius, the very famous historian of the first century. Now, this is a problem. And of course, many of my detractors then turn around and say, no, impossible, because Josephus Flavius was born in AD 37, much too late for the gospel story. Gospel story was in the AD 30s, late 20s, early 30s. You cannot have a Saul who was born that late. Well, actually, you can, because the story still fits. The main contention is they say that, oh, Saul went out on these evangelical tours in about AD 52 was his first tour of the Mediterranean. He can't be going across the Mediterranean as a child, but of course he can, because within Judaism, Saul became a man aged 14.
Yeah, it's the bar mitzvah, isn't it?
At his bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
They still do today. You are a man at
Mm.
14 and you can get married, have a house, have a family. You are a man at 14. So, of course, you can go across the Mediterranean age 15, as he would have been in AD 52. And again, people would not believe it. But as I say to them, if you get a couple of Mormons knocking on your door in the 21st century, what do you get? Do you get a couple of old geezers?
No,
No,
no.
you get a guy aged 19 and you get his kid who's probably age 15 or 16. That's what you get knocking on
Yeah.
your door.
Mm.
Because that's what these religions do. They send out the youngsters evangelizing across the world nowadays, of course, but then across the Mediterranean when they're young and they don't have any responsibilities. So they send them out early when they're still in their youth, evangelizing for the church. And as I've said previously, if I get a word of warning to any Mormons, if I get a knock on the door from any Mormons, I don't shut the door in their face. No, that's not nice. I let them into the house and then I shut the door behind them. And then I've got them for 4 hours.
Brilliant.
Until they're banging on the door trying to leave.
You're their worst nightmare.
So, yeah, my contention was, and this was my contention back in 1997, was that Saul was Josephus. And this changes the story. And they don't like this because it has ramifications. And the primary ramification is that Josephus Flavius, as the primary historian of the first century, did write about Jesus, but not in the way that people want him to be writing about Jesus. The story fits because the whole point of Josephus Flavius's books is he wrote a story of the Jewish revolt. And during the Jewish revolt, well, let's look at it from the biblical aspect to start with. In the Acts of the Apostles, we have Saul going around Galilee, arresting the proto-Christians and throwing them into prison. From here all the way to Damascus, from Jerusalem, as it were, to Damascus. How was Saul doing that? Under what authority was Saul throwing people into prison who were these proto-Christians? It's not mentioned. I mean, Saul was just sort of a bit of a nobody, although later on we find out he was a bit of a somebody, because when he was in jail, all of the procurators and the kings came to see Paul Saul when he was in prison. So he was obviously quite influential. Otherwise, these powerful people wouldn't come to see him and ask for bribes from him. So he was obviously quite wealthy as well, but we still don't sort of know who he was. But how is he arresting people and throwing them into prison? Well, if he was Josephus Flavius, then we know exactly how he was doing that, because Josephus Flavius was not only a historian, he was the army commander in charge of Galilee from AD 65 onwards. And what he was doing in Galilee is chasing a guy called Jesus all the way across Galilee. Jesus of Gamala.
Yeah.
And remember the cry from Jesus, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Well, what Josephus Flavius was doing at this time was persecuting a guy called Jesus. It's the same story. We have so many connections between these two stories. People will not accept this because it's upsetting the apple cart somewhat. to me, it's not changing the story. The story is exactly the same. But to believers, it's changing the story too much. It means that Jesus was alive in the AD 60s. Well, they don't like that for a starters, because it's upsetting their original belief system of the chronology of these events. It means that Jesus was relatively powerful and influential. It means he was a king. Okay, but the Gospels say that anyway, so we've got that dichotomy sitting there in the middle of the Gospels anyway. You know, people say, oh, he's just a carpenter. Yeah, but he was called a king on 36 occasions.
Yeah. The carpenter reference is to do with a mistranslation of a Greek word. Is it tecton?
Yeah, tecton. So he's not called a carpenter, he's called a tecton, and a tecton really means an architect. You can still hear it in the English. And of course, a tecton in the Greek is the word for a Freemason.
Wow.
And so Jesus was a Freemason. He was the master of the Judean lodge in the first century. And we know this to be so because the raising of Lazarus is a third degree raising.
That's interesting because, sorry, I believe that the Masons, or, you know, the official word is that Masonry started in the late 18th century, I believe.
Early 1717 with Grand Lodge.
Yeah.
But we know that it started before then because Grand Lodge was the coming together of previously existing lodges. So we know it existed before 1717. But also the history of Masonry celebrates the building of the Temple of Solomon. So its entire history stems from the 9th century BC and the building of the Temple of Solomon. That's where the story comes from. And you read books like the Kebra Nagast, which is the Ethiopian Bible, it says that King Solomon was a Freemason.
Wow.
So we have, and we, of course, going back into a slightly more recent history, we have the Masonic guilds of medieval Europe, who again were pseudo-Masonic, who had the same sort of symbolism. So we know that this is an old institution that goes back to the age of King Solomon, and we know it was present during the biblical era because the raising of Lazarus is a third degree raising. It's exactly the same as the ceremony I went through when I became a Master Mason. And so Lazarus was being raised from the dead. He was Hiram Abiff, as in the, you know, the third degree initiation. He was Hiram Abiff being laid in the tomb for 3 days and then being raised from the dead by the Master Mason. And the Master Mason in this particular case was Jesus himself, who raised Lazarus from the dead. And, you know, if resurrection is the key to becoming the Messiah, the leader of the church, then people should be they should be venerating Lazarus because he was raised from the dead before Jesus was. So why aren't they venerating Lazarus? Well, because this was a ceremony. Although it sounds like the original first century ceremony was rather tougher than the modern one. So in the modern ceremony, you only die for 30 minutes and you are laid to rest in a tomb. Okay, most modern lodges don't have a tomb, but if you go to some of the old lodges, they will have a casket and you're laid out in the casket. In the biblical version, it sounds like they were actually laid out in a tomb for 3 days. So they were actually incarcerated in a tomb, cut off from the world. So it was probably quite a difficult initiation. You were cut off from the world in total darkness for 3 days. And the point, well, one of the points, there's many points to these ceremonies, is you are completely and utterly dependent on your colleagues coming to rescue you. because you are stuck. You cannot get out of this tomb. You are entombed. You are dead unless your colleagues come and open that door. And that's a part of the reason for these initiation ceremonies. It shows a trust between you and your compatriots. A bonding session, as it were. That's part of the reason for the third degree. So, yeah, Jesus was Freemason in the first century of the Judean Lodge. He was the master mason. He was probably actually Grand Master of that lodge. So, yes, where did we get to? So we got to the identity of Saul. And that gives us a very different perspective on the gospel story. It shifts the timeline. So we're no longer talking about the AD 30s, we're talking about the AD 60s. There is a 40-year gap between the two. And we know there is a 40-year gap because if you look at the gospel story, it has differences on what it considers to be the timeline. So we have the standard timeline according to Pontius Pilate being there, who's an AD 20s, 30s character. But we have other problems within the gospel story which point towards a later date. So we have Jesus talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, about Jerusalem being surrounded by a wall and a trench, and not one stone will be laid upon the other. That is a description of the Jewish revolt, AD 66 to AD 70, and the destruction of Jerusalem when the Romans stuck a wall around the whole of Jerusalem when it was under siege.
So this is not a prophecy we're talking about, no?
Well, in the Gospels, they say it's a prophecy, but of course, from the mouth of Jesus, he's describing the Jewish revolt. Now, unless you believe in prophecy or the Gospel writers putting a prophecy back into the mouth of Jesus at a later date, then we have a problem with the timeline. And this, by the way, is why that theologians and historians will confidently say, oh, well, you know, the Gospels were only written in the AD 70s. So there was a period of 40 years of oral transmission before they were written down, because they know there's AD 70s material in the Gospels. And you have to think to yourself, hold on a minute. The Jews were avid chroniclers. They wrote about everything. I mean, you've only got to read the works of Josephus to know that they were a highly literate society who wrote down their entire history. Why do they need a 40-year period of oral transmission from a people who were highly literate? And, you know, from the Dead Sea Scrolls and everywhere else, we know they were writing all of this material down. Well, because they've got a 40-year gap in the history. And all they can say is we've got a 40-year period of oral transmission. It's what I call the chronological chasm between the gospel story and where it actually happened, according to me. And according to, of course, with Saul being Josephus. And we have this from the Gospels as well, because Jesus also laments the murder of Zacharias Barachias, who was murdered in the middle of the temple. Now that's a problem again, because we know when this happened. It happened in AD 68, because Zacharias Barachias was one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt, and he was murdered in the middle of the temple in AD 68. Problem, you see? And we have it again with Benzizit Hakeseth. Now, we have this story. People won't know about this because it's a bit hidden, but Jesus mocks this guy, Zizit ben Hakeseth, This is from Matthew 23:5. And he's mocking this guy because they make broad their phylacteries. That's the boxes that they stick on their heads, and enlarge their borders of their garments, etc., etc. So he's mocking this guy for his ostentatious richness. And the phylacteries and the tassels rhyme with his name. They loved these rhymes within the Talmud, especially. And it rhymes with his name, which is Ben Zizit Hakaseth. And we know this because the same story appears in the Talmud. Exactly the same story with the same mockery of the same person. And then it goes on to explain it's because his name rhymed with tassels and cushions and phylacteries. Problem, because this comes again from the mouth of Jesus, and Ben Zizit Hakaseth was one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt in the late 80s, 60s. And it goes on and on. So we have this dislocation in the chronology. And if we believe this concept of Saul being Josephus, this again points to the ministry of Jesus being in the AD 60s, and that he was a leader of the Jewish revolt. Because, of course, Jesus was jailed alongside revolutionaries who had committed murder in the revolution. What revolution was this in the AD 30s? Whereas in the AD 60s, we know what revolution it was. It was the Jewish revolt. And this particular character was indeed jailed by the Romans. And we have further evidence from this, from the Talmud, because the Talmud mentions Jesus on quite a few occasions. And you've got to ask yourself, why would the Talmud be discussing a mythological character? It would be like, medieval history, probably later history, discussing the life of Robin Hood. I mean, there would be no point about the Church of England discussing the life of Robin Hood because he's a mythological character. So why does the Talmud discuss the biblical Jesus? Tricky, that one. It's probably because he was a real person. But the Talmud also discusses this guy we were talking about before, who was called Jesus of Gamala. The guy that was
going to ask you about him. And what do we know of Jesus of Gamala?
Well, from the historical record, not very much, but he's mentioned on numerous occasions by Josephus Flavius, and he's mentioned on numerous occasions by the Talmud. Now, he was the governor of Galilee. He was the governor of Tiberias in Galilee. And I link him with Jesus Cephius because we have these two characters called Jesus who were both the governor of Galilee at the same time. So I think Jesus Cephius and Jesus of Gamala were the same person. Jesus of Gamala was the guy who was being persecuted by Josephus Flavius. Jesus Cephius, who I think was the same character, was the leader of 600 rebel fishermen.
Really? Wow.
Now, who was the leader of fishermen in the first century?
Of course.
We're talking about the Jesus character. More than that, the Talmud says that Jesus of Gamala, same guy, married Mary Magdalene. Now, that's a problem. It says that he married Mary Boethus. Now, Mary Boethus was the daughter of Simon. And of course, Mary Magdalene lived at the house of Simon. In fact, it goes on to say that Jesus of Gamala married Mary and Martha. And of course, the Bethany sisters were Mary and Martha, who lived at the house of Simon. And the father of the Boethus sisters was called Simon. Now, this is not just from myself. This was also from Professor Robert Eisenman, who wrote a Oh, he wrote about 300 pages on this. Anyway, he's got a large extract in his book, James, the brother of Jesus, about this character called Mary Bothus and her links with Mary Magdalene. And they're pretty obviously the same person. But Eisenman can't say that. At the end of this big, long analysis, he has to say, of course, this can't be a Mary Magdalene because they live in different eras. So they must have based the life of Mary Magdalene upon the life of Mary Bothus. So he can't bring himself to bridge that chronological chasm and understand that the gospel stories actually happened in the AD 60s. If we can understand that, we know that Mary Bothus was Mary Magdalene, and she married Jesus of Gamala, the guy who was being persecuted by Josephus Flavius, who I say was the biblical Jesus. And the problem with this, because, you know, if Christians wanted to look through the records and do an analysis of all of this, they could say, we have found our Jesus in the historical record. But they can't, and they won't, because it's not the Jesus they want to find. Because Mary Magdalene, Mary Bothus, was the richest woman in the Near East. Now, that's a little bit of a problem. When she got married to Jesus of Gamala, the biblical Jesus, her dowry from her father or from her father-in-law, I'm not sure entirely which one gave it, was 1 million gold denarii. Worth in today's money about... Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say, how much is that worth in today's money?
In today's money, it's about $20 billion.
Wow. Wow, serious money. Wow.
And that's just her dowry. That's not the wealth of their family. That's just the dowry. She was the richest woman in the whole of Judea. And it goes on to say how rich she was, the inordinate price of her bedspread, that she had 400 liters or something of wine weekly was delivered to her door, and her foot never touched the ground. She only ever walked upon carpets. All of these, because they were making fun of her for being so ostentatious, for being so rich. And after the Jewish revolt, it makes even more fun of her because she is penniless. At the end of the Jewish revolt, she loses all her money. And Yohanan ben Zakkai, who wrote the Talmud, finds her after the Jewish revolt picking up grains of barley from between the dung of donkeys because she's starving. And it's one of these stories of, you know, how the mighty have fallen. So that's why they're playing on this story. And then it says, you know, and they love to say this about how people die. And her foot touched one of the droppings of the donkey, and she immediately died. Just trying to juxtapose that with her previous life, where she only ever walked on carpets, never on the ground, you know. So we have this problem. Here we have the biblical story, but it's of a very rich, royal biblical story with Mary Magdalene.
Basically, Jesus and all the characters kind of in and around him are basically royalty. Is that right?
Yes, which is why he was called a king. He was king. He was called a king at his birth, and he was called a king at his crucifixion, and he was called a king on 36 occasions. So why will people not believe this when the Gospels say he was a king? They say, "Oh, yes, but that was just you know, figure of speech." No, he's a real king.
He follows in the line of David, doesn't he? King David?
Yes, of course.
According to the New Testament.
Yeah, he was of the line of David because he was a real proper king. And now we have a problem in our investigation because I'd found all of this and discovered most of this. And you have this story of this king How do you lose a king in the historical record? Why did this guy go missing from the historical record so nobody knows about this guy? How is that possible? Well, it's possible because Josephus Flavius wrote the story. And Josephus Flavius was working for Rome. His paymaster was Vespasian, Emperor Vespasian. And Rome didn't want anyone to know about this story because the story was about the Jewish revolt, a revolt against Rome. And the last thing Rome wanted was any further revolts on the eastern borders of the empire. And so it's quite obvious that what Vespasian said to Josephus is, you can write this story. We want you to write. He was commissioned to write this story in terms of the Jewish revolt, which he calls his bellum, his Jewish wars, in order to instruct other people on the might of Rome and how dare you rise up against Rome, because you will be destroyed in the same way that the Jews were destroyed in AD 70. So he was commissioned to write this book, which he did, and he sent this book beyond the Euphrates to the Babylonian Jews who lived beyond the Euphrates. Yeah, okay. Why? I mean, this was the Jewish revolt. And of course, if we're talking about Jewish revolts, you know, if you've ever looked at this story, it's a minor problem in Judea.
So the Euphrates River, that runs through Turkey and Syria, I think?
Yeah, it comes down through Turkey, through northeastern Syria, down into Iraq. So we're talking Mesopotamia here, anywhere between the two rivers. So why did this story get written and presented to the Babylonian Jews beyond the Euphrates? Nothing to do with Judea, because it was the Babylonian Jews from beyond the Euphrates who started the Jewish revolt, according to Josephus. You won't find that in history because most historians disregard that. They don't even talk about that. But that's what actually happened. Somewhere we have here, we have a couple of quotes here. So Josephus calls this place Adiabeni. We'll go through this in a minute. So Josephus says, the most valiant, this is at the beginning of the Jewish revolt. This is when the Roman army, the legion of Cestius, was destroyed in Judea, outside Jerusalem. And he says the most valiant of the Jews were the kinsmen of Mon, and their names were Monobazus and Kenadius. Okay. And then at the surrender, after the Jewish revolt ended, and the rebels were surrendering to Titus in Jerusalem, it says, the sons and the brethren of King Isates besought Caesar, who was Vespasian at the time, to give them his right hand for their security. And Vespasian kept them all in custody, but still bound the king's sons and kinsmen and led them with him to Rome, to jail in Rome, in order to make them hostages for their country's fidelity to the Romans. So this was the beginning and the end of the Jewish revolt, and it has nothing to do with Jerusalem. It has to do with this strange place called Adiabeni that lies beyond the Euphrates with the Babylonian Jews. That puts a very different spin on the history of Judea, because it's not this is not really mentioned in the history of Judea. If you read a historical book, it doesn't really mention the Adiabenans very much. And it puts a different spin on the gospel story if the gospel story was about the Jewish revolt. It means that if we're looking for a lost king, we don't necessarily have to look for a lost king in Judea. We could look for a lost king amongst the Jews beyond the Euphrates. Now that's different. That gives us a lot more leeway into finding this character. And what I eventually discovered is that these kings came from Edessa. So how did, because I'd never heard of, I wrote all of these books. And in fact, I wrote my book called Jesus, King of Edessa. And it wasn't even called that when I started it. That book was called Queen Helena. And it was only halfway through the book that I suddenly discovered there was a place called Edessa. And Edessa is a small town. It was a very influential principality in northern Syria. It's now called Sanlerfa. Who owned a principality that ran from Edessa in the north of Syria, all the way down nearly as far as Damascus. And it covered Palmyra out in the eastern desert.
Yeah.
And that was their, I mean, it sounds a little bit small, but it's actually bigger than England. So it was quite a large principality. But most of it is desert, so it's not all habitable. But it includes some very influential towns like Edessa, which people might not have heard of, but was the first Christian city in the world. Haran, just south of Edessa, which was the town that Abraham came from. And Palmyra, which sprang to prominence in the 1st century AD, became the Rose of the Desert. Anyway, it became a huge, great city in the Syrian desert in the 1st century AD. So how did they get there? It's probably worth just very, very quickly going through the history of how I think they actually rose to prominence. This goes back to, and this shows the links that we have between the gospel story and Egypt, why Jesus was called the Egyptian false prophet. And we know he was the Egyptian false prophet because it was the Egyptian false prophet who took the 5,000 out into the wilderness. Right. The same as Jesus did. So he has these links with Egypt. Back in the 40s BC, Queen Cleopatra was with Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is killed, Ides of March. And Queen Cleopatra runs back to Egypt because her life is in danger. But Cicero says that she is pregnant. And he is fearing the appearance of a scion of Caesar, an heir to Caesar, who is Egyptian. And the last thing he wants is an Egyptian heir taking over the throne of Rome. And he's very worried about this. But then the crisis is over. Why? Well, either the child was miscarried or she was a girl. Because a girl could not become emperor of Rome. We move on about 25 years, and now we have Augustus is the emperor of Rome, and he's sorting out his borders, and he sends Juba II, who's the king of Mauritania, that's sort of the king of North Africa, who is a client king, obviously, of Rome. He sends Juba II a diplomatic bride, who is the daughter of Cleopatra, and she's Cleopatra Selene. And they build quite a large empire out in North Africa, very successful. So he gets a daughter of Cleopatra who is an incarnation of Isis as being his queen. Quite a prize, really. And then Augustus goes to the east, and he goes to Phraates IV, who's the powerful king of Parthia, Persia. And remember that Rome had already lost about 4 legions fighting against Parthia. They were very, very powerful. They had lost 3 of their standards in the battles against Parthia. So he needs to do something special to placate Phraates IV. And so he gives him a prostitute called Theomusa Aurania. And you're reading this and thinking, that doesn't work. I mean, you can't disrespect a powerful king like Phraates IV by giving him a lowly courtesan. That's not going to work. So who was this lady? For many reasons, she just has to be the other lost daughter of Cleopatra.
Okay.
And he was so impressed with this gift, this diplomatic bride, that he made her the chief queen and the queen of all Parthia. And her name is Queen Thea Musa Aurania. Again, another monarch who's dropped out of history because no one wants to talk about her. And for a long time, it was considered that she was a figment of Josephus's imagination, because it was just a ribald story about this queen. But then they started discovering her coins all across modern Iraq. So she is a real queen. But she got thrown out of Parthia in AD 4 for murdering her husband, which is, I suppose, a fairly good reason for getting thrown out of the country. So in about 2 BC, she killed her husband and she assumed the throne of Parthia, which is why we find her coins in Parthia, in a co-regency with her son, Phraates. So in AD 4, they were thrown out of Parthia and went to Syria. And so now we have the Nativity story. What is the Nativity? It's a story about a king. We know Jesus was a king, being born in a state of some poverty for some strange reason, who was blessed by the gods, who had the Parthian Magi, the Persian Magi, come to his birth. Why would the Persian Magi want to come and visit a Jew in Judea? Makes no sense, does it?
No.
But in this particular scenario, what we have is a royal family, Queen Thea Musa Aurania, being thrown out of the east in a state of poverty because they had no palace to live in, possibly having to find shelter at an inn or a stable, having a royal birth, that the Magi, the kingmakers of Parthia, would indeed be interested in, because here was a potential king of all Parthia. So, of course, they were bringing gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the birth of this particular royal child.
These two stories align beautifully, don't they? There's no question about that.
But it was, I'd looked at this obviously for decades and not seen where this story came from, because the story made no sense. It could not be aligned with anything in the historical record. Not until I found out about the history of Queen Thea Musa Aurania, who I'd never heard of. And it was thanks to a 19th century author, not a historian, he was an amateur historian in the Victorian era, who wrote the history of Queen Thea Musa Aurania and wrote this manuscript, which he deposited in the British Library. And there is only one copy in the world of this manuscript. And that's, well, two, because I got a photocopied copy of it.
Oh, well done.
So it's pretty rare. There's only two copies of this story in the world. And that's how I found out about Queen Thea Musa Aurania, because I'd never heard of her before. And the story does resonate with the Nativity story. And it also resonates with the foundation of Edessa, because we don't really know where Edessa came from, because it's been covered up. So there is a strange thing in the works of Josephus, because Josephus knows every major event and every major personality in first century Judea. And yet you can type in to his works by, I normally use the Whiston translation. You can type in Edessa to a computer and it will say, nothing found. And you can type in the name of the royals, King Abgarus of Edessa, and it'll say, nothing found. Why is that? Why is Edessa missing from the works of Josephus when he must have known about the works of Josephus? Because, well, here's a thing for you. Saul, who I say was Josephus, was the ambassador of Edessa. He worked for this royal family. And we know that because it says so in the Gospels. So if you read Acts of the Apostles, and I might as well quote this, this comes from Acts 11:28. And it says, there stood up one of them named Agabus, that's King Agbarus of Edessa, and signified by the Spirit that there would be a great drought through all of the world, a famine basically, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. The disciples determined to send relief to their brethren in Judea, which they did, and they sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So this famine relief was sent to Judea by Barnabas and Saul, and it was sent from King Abgarus of Edessa. So Saul and Barnabas must have been the ambassadors of Edessa. And we doubly know this because this famine relief was sent by Queen Helena, another person that you can see how we lose royals quite easily, you know.
I was going
Queen
to say
Helena.
that, yeah, she was believed to be a fictitious character up until fairly recently, wasn't she?
She was indeed. She is another of these royals that they want to deny because her history is controversial. So we have this powerful queen of Adiabene, the town that Josephus Flavius was talking about, and she sent this famine relief money, this same famine relief money, down to Judea that was sent by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. And you're thinking, hold on a minute, there's a dichotomy here because Adiabene doesn't exist. If you look around Iraq, where it's supposed to be, there is no evidence for an Adiabene out there. It's supposed to be Arbela, but there's no evidence for it ever being there. And now the famine relief money is supposed to be coming from Edessa, which we do have evidence for. We know the city. We've found the palace of the Edessan kings and everything else, and the coins and whatever. So what's the connection between the two? Well, for a long time, I didn't know the connection because it's not made obvious. But when I was out in Syria, I came across various Syrian books written by Turkish historians, not translated into English. I've never found them in England. And they were giving the history of Edessa and the history of the Armenian Christians and Jews of Armenia, because they're obviously a proud people. They're not Turks, and they were saying that they've been treated badly by the Turks, but they've always been loyal to Turkey, etc., etc. And this is our history, because we don't want to forget our history. But of course, a part of the history of Armenia is the history of Edessa. And the Armenian historians and chroniclers from quite early on say that Queen Helena of Adiabene was the wife of King Abgarus of Edessa. Okay, so now we see our connection. So either Adiabene and Edessa are linked by these two royals, or they are indeed the same place. And I think that for many reasons, I think they are the same place. The reason that Josephus Flavius was calling it Adiabene is because he had been forbidden by Vespasian from talking about Edessa. Edessa had become a non-city, a non-principality, with a non-royalty who were never to be mentioned. They were completely taboo, which is why they have been deleted from all of his works and deleted from the majority of Roman works as well. You will not find any references to Edessa. You will only find references to Edessa in the Armenian works.
This is
because,
Moses of Corian?
yes, Moses of Corinne.
Yeah.
He was Armenian, a Syriac historian who was writing the history of Armenia. And Armenia covers Edessa because the Edessan kings were also the kings of Armenia on occasions. Armenia has never really been an integral state on its own. It's always been owned by other people. So quite often the kings of Armenia were the kings of Parthia. And they governed the whole place. And on occasions, the kings of Armenia were the kings of Edessa, and they ruled the entire region. So you get this crossover between the two histories. And we know that Josephus was deleting on purpose the history of Edessa, because we have this again from Moses of Corinne. We have a very famous event about John the Baptist, when John the Baptist got beheaded. So this was a dispute about the daughter of Aretas. That's why John the Baptist got beheaded. So Aretas of Petra gave his daughter, was married to Herod Antipas of Judea. But Herod Antipas, for whatever reason, didn't like this wife and wanted to divorce her and marry. He married the mother of Salome, Herodias. So he married Herodias instead and sent his previous wife, who was called Pharsalus, back to Petra, back to Aretas of Petra. And a couple of things happened because of that. One is that John the Baptist complained about this marriage because it was not lawful. And so John the Baptist got his head knocked off and taken on a platter via Salome to Judea. And the second thing that happened, and might be to do with that as well, not just the marriage, but also the beheading of John, was that Aretas of Petra sent an army to go and punish Herod Antipas. And we have two accounts of this. So we have the account from Josephus Flavius, who says, Aretas made enmity between him and Herod Antipas. So they prepared for war. And when they had joined battle, all of Herod's army was destroyed by the treachery of some fugitives who joined Aretas's army from Syria. And again, with Josephus, you've got to look at his texts and you've got to understand that everything he says has a Roman slant on it. You know, this is propaganda as much as it is history. Why won't he tell us who these fugitives are who defeated King Aretas in Jerusalem, in Judea? There's got to be a political spin here. So what is the spin? Well, the spin is we have exactly the same story from Moses of Corinne. And he was writing the same story because it affected his people up in Armenia. And Moses of Corinne says, King Abgar of Edessa allied himself with King Aretas of Petra and gave him some auxiliary troops to make war upon Herod Antipas. Being sharply attacked, Herod's troops were defeated thanks to the help of the brave Edessans. Okay, now we know who these fugitives were. Note that Josephus calls them fugitives. Very derogatory, not only covering up the fact of who these people are, but making a derogatory statement about them. They're just fugitives from... No, it was the army of King Abgarus of Edessa that defeated King Aretas in an alliance with defeated King Antipas in an alliance with King Aretas of Petra. So we can see from this that Josephus has deleted Edessa from his history. We're not going to find it there. All we find is these references to Yabeni, which has been deliberately covered up so you don't know what it is, where it is. Why did he do that? Because it's so intimately linked with the biblical story. Well, no, that's not why Josephus did it. We have two problems here. Rome didn't want this story because they didn't want you to know about Edessa, because Edessa started the Jewish revolt, and Rome didn't want you to know anything about revolts against Rome. They wanted the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And having revolts was not in their playbook. And so they wanted anything to do with Edessa deleting from history. So you didn't know that it was possible that people could start revolts against Rome. So they became persona non grata. They were completely taboo. Later on, the Catholic Church adopted the same position, because the last thing they wanted you to know is that Edessa was closely linked to the biblical story. And that the king of Edessa, who started the Jewish revolt and got crucified at the end of the Jewish revolt, might have been the biblical Jesus. The problem being that the king of Edessa at the time of the Jewish revolt was called King Jesus Manu of Edessa. And the biblical Jesus was called King Jesus Emmanuel of Judea. And King Jesus Manu of Edessa was the king of Judea and the king of the Jews in the first century. Because his mother, the famous Queen Helena, who we've been talking about, she became a Nazarene Jew. And she was initiated into Nazarene Judaism, and she became the Queen of Judea in the AD 40s and 50s. And she had the largest palace and the largest tomb in Jerusalem. She was the Queen of Judea. She was the Queen of the Jews. And her son, King Jesus Manu, became the King of the Jews. And who was the King of the Jews in the first century? It was King Jesus Emmanuel. Because they made this little prophecy up, she will have a son and call his name Emmanuel. Well, there's a problem with that prophecy in that Jesus was never called Emmanuel. Throughout the whole of the Gospels, he was never, ever called Emmanuel. So the prophecy is entirely meaningless. And yet, unless you know what the prophecy was talking about. And the prophecy was talking about, to the initiated, who the Jesus character was. So, to the initiated, they would immediately know that Jesus Manu was Jesus Emmanuel. Because that's what the prophecy said.
And what I love about this, Ralph, is the fact that to this day in Edessa or Sanliurfa and all around that region, they refer to Jesus as Issa.
Yes, they do.
Which is a big wow.
And Issa comes from Jesus. So the Bible has been translated, especially into English, but even within the Greek and the and Hebrew, it's been translated with a Christian slant on it. And so they wanted a Hebrew word that was the equivalent of Jesus. And so they said he was called Joshua. But I see no evidence whatsoever that Jesus was actually the name Jesus, which in Greek is Isius, was ever derived from Joshua or Yeshua in the Hebrew. I think it was derived from the Persian name, which is Izates. which is the name for the kings of Edessa. They were called Isates. But
Mm.
of course, within the works of Josephus, he has a nickname, which is Esus. And I think Jesus, Esius, and Issa all came from the word Esus, which was the Parthian name for the Edessan kings.
I've heard some people say that Manu is a title rather than a name. Is that true?
A lot of these names were titles rather than names. Like in the works of Josephus, he was called Monobazus. And people take that as being a name. Even in historical works, they take that as being a name of the Adiabeni Edessan king.
Well, Mono means only, and Bazus means king, doesn't it? I think
it does. Yeah. And I'm looking at this thinking, hold on a minute, they didn't speak Greek very well. The lingua franca of that region was Greek. But of course, the majority of people spoke Aramaic. So Greek for a lot of people would have been their second language. And yes, all they're doing is they are using a bastardized sort of Greek name. So I'm just looking at my screens here. I've suddenly got two screens of myself. Okay, that's better. Yes, in that part of the world, they were just using a bastardized, poorly translated Greek name, meaning the only king. It's so obvious, it's untrue. So it wasn't a name, it was a title. He was called the only king of Edessa. And of course, Jesus had more or less the same title. He was called the only begotten son.
Can I just also ask you, I've heard somewhere before that Manu is connected to an Eastern prophecy. Does that ring any bells with you? It's the name Manu?
I'm not, well, there are several possibilities on the origins of Manu. A lot of the early Egyptian kings, the first king of Egypt was called Manu. There is a story within the Hindu religion about one of their gods or demigods being called Manu. And then we have the Greek translation being the only king. So I'm not sure entirely where that name or that title has come from. It might just mean the only king. So he was called King Esus, the only king of Edessa and Parthia. Or it might have a much older heritage to it. I'm not quite sure on that.
Sorry, so where was we before I distracted you? Where was we? We were talking about Isates Manu, the name.
Yes. So we have this monarchy from Edessa who were involved in the Jewish revolt. Several interesting things about this which drop out of this information. One is that the leaders of the Jewish revolt were crucified after the revolt failed. So we have the story from the Gospels. So we have Jesus being crucified while wearing a purple cloak and a crown of thorns. And of course, the traditional crown of Edessa was a crown of thorns.
Yeah.
And then we have this story from Josephus Flavius, where the leaders of the Jewish revolt, the three leaders of the revolt, were crucified after the fall of Jerusalem. And so they were being crucified, but Josephus Flavius himself comes back from Tekoa, which is to the south of Jerusalem, passes by this scene and sees the three leaders of the Jewish revolt being crucified. And he's aghast that they would do anything so stupid, because they are of much more value to Rome alive than dead. So he immediately goes to the governor, gets permission to take them down from the cross, and they are taken down early. 2 of them die, and 1 of them survives. Familiar story? 3 people on the cross, taken down early, 2 die, 1 survives, and they were taken down by Josephus of Arimathea. You've got to remember that the father of Josephus was called Matthias. Arimathea. It's highly likely that Joseph of Arimathea is Josephus Flavius, because we don't know who this shining knight that comes out of nowhere at the end of the gospel story swoops in and takes Jesus down from the cross. Someone who's able to go to the governor, get permission to the governor, and get these fugitives, these rebels, taken down from the cross early. Who was this guy that had such power with Rome that he could go and do so? Well, in the guise of Josephus Flavius, this guy did. Because, as he says, these were his former compatriots, because remember, he had changed sides. He had worked for the Jews against Rome, and then he changed sides, and he was working for the Romans against the Jews. He was on first name terms with the emperor and his son Titus. He was working for them as their minister of propaganda, had been working with them for the last 2-3 years as their propaganda minister. Of course, he could go to the governor, who at that time was Titus, and say, can we take these guys down from the cross? Because they're worth more to you alive than they are dead. And that's what he did, and he took them down. And we have this also from Arthurian legend, because I wrote a book about Arthurian legend as well, because I noticed all of these similarities. There is a problem with Arthurian legend in that most of it is to do with the 1st century. As you might know, that the hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. Yeah, okay, that's a problem, because he's 1st century Judea, nothing to do with Britain.
Sorry, Ralph, was it Geoffrey of Monmouth who placed Arthur in the 5th or 6th century?
Yes, most of the books try and place him in the 5th century, 6th century. So Monmouth puts him in the 6th century. However, if you look at the other works, and they're not much later, they're only from the, so Monmouth is 1135 for the writing of his books. They're only from less than a century later. And we get the Vulgate cycle, which is this enormous great corpus of Arthurian legend. 9 volumes, probably about 4,500-5,000 pages of Arthurian legend. Huge, great story. And it's a very different story, tells lots of different tales. And a lot of it is about Joseph of Arimathea. Hence, we have all these stories about Joseph of Arimathea coming to Glastonbury and all the rest of it. And one of the heretical things they say, well, 2 of the heretical things they say, is that Joseph of Arimathea was the guy that shopped Jesus to the Romans. So Judas was innocent, Gov. It was Joseph of Arimathea that did it. Okay, well, that's a slight problem. The second thing they say is that Joseph of Arimathea was a knight working for Emperor Vespasian for 7 years. Now, that's a problem as well, because again, we come back to our chronological chasm. How can Joseph of Arimathea be putting Jesus in a tomb in AD 30 and working for Emperor Vespasian as a knight in the AD 70s? bit tricky.
Yep.
So what they say is, and they have this wonderful story about Josephus, is that Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus down from the cross in the AD 30s. And then he's arrested by the governor and thrown into prison. And Joseph goes to sleep for 3 days, and he wakes up 40 years later. And he's just the same age. He hasn't aged at all.
Wow.
And he's discovered and taken out of the prison by Emperor Vespasian, which is how he becomes a knight working for Emperor Vespasian. And so now he has jumped the chronological chasm from the AD 30s up into the AD 70s when these events really happened, because this chronological chasm obscures every single bit of history from this era. Anything that has anything to do with the Gospels has to be shoved back into the AD 30s, because that's when the Gospels say it happened. But it didn't, and so it distorts the whole of this history. And you have to be able to sort out the real dates before you can see what the real events were. So the forbidden problem and identification is that we have another character for Josephus Flavius. So Josephus Flavius was Saul, but he was also called Joseph of Arimathea. That's who he was. That's why we have this shining knight that comes out of the middle of nowhere and asks for Jesus to be taken down from the cross, because that's exactly what Josephus did himself, as he records himself in his own biography in AD 70, after the Jewish revolt, when he was working as a knight for Emperor Vespasian. So the story matches. It is the same story. And I had to write a history of Arthurian legend about it, because Arthurian legend mentions this. And also because there is a huge problem and heresy at the center of Arthurian legend. We won't go into this too much because it's too much of a long story to go through it. But one of the heresies of Arthurian legend is that several of the manuscripts say that the original author of Arthurian legend was Josephus Flavius. And again, that's a huge problem, but a problem that we will address maybe at a later time.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's my my complete analysis of the Gospel era, and it took 5 books in the end to run through this. But the main ones were Cleopatra to Christ, which is an introduction to the Phraates IV and the Queen Musa Aurania problem. Then we have King Jesus, which is a discussion about the Saul and Josephus problem. And then we have Jesus, King of Edessa, which runs through the evidence as to why Jesus was a king of Edessa. So that trilogy, which is now a trilogy in at least 4 parts, underpins the whole of my thesis. And it's pretty comprehensive.
Carry on.
Yep. No, I was just saying it's pretty comprehensive.
Where can my viewers find your books?
Okay, so they're all on Amazon now. I've retired onto Amazon because it was too hard to maintain my own stocks of books. So the books are all now print on demand by Amazon. Okay. So they print an individual book for you. That means I don't have to hold any stocks. So that's much easier. But in a way, I would recommend the tablet versions more because it's all in color. Print on demand is not in color at present, unfortunately. Okay. So at least in the tablet books, it's all in color. And of course, they're much cheaper as well. They're a third the price. So they're available on Amazon and Kobo and Barnes and Noble and something else that I've forgotten. So that's the best way. Try and get the 2017 or later editions, because I notice there's a lot of old editions knocking around at stupid prices, and I don't know why, because I thought they were all sold long ago. But anyway, if you go for the 2017 or later versions, they will be the latest.
Great, Ralph. Thank you. And you also have a really good Facebook page as well that I follow, and I highly encourage anyone watching this to jump on board, because some of the posts are really, really interesting. And they're not all to do with Jesus. You've got stuff on climate science and megaliths and ancient history in Egypt and all sorts of wonderful stuff. So
yes, that's another thing I do. That's my Facebook page is ralph.ellis.144. And so with a Google search, you should be able to pick that up. But yes, I'm a climate scientist as well. So I've written papers on climate science.
I'd love to have you on talking about that for a video, if possible, in the future.
Yeah, because that's heretical as well. Yeah, they don't like my gospel analysis, and they don't like my climate analysis either. I did a analysis of the ice ages, because despite climate scientists saying they know everything about climate science and they can predict the exact weather on the 4th of May 2086, they know exactly what the weather's going to be on that day. They still don't know why ice ages happen. And so I looked at this a few years back now. So I think this was printed, because it's a peer review proper paper, was peer reviewed and printed back in 2016, I think it was, where I go into this and I discovered why ice ages happen in the way that they do. And it's very different to what anyone else has discussed previously, because I do not have CO2 in that argument whatsoever. So well, no, that's the wrong thing to say. I do not have CO2 operating in the fashion that climate scientists say it does. I have it operating in totally the opposite fashion to what they say. So I have it that less CO2 causes warming, more CO2 causes cooling. And there's a good reason for that. So yes, maybe at some point we can have a chat about that one.
That would be lovely, because I've already got about 50 questions I can ask you on that, because I find the subject fascinating. So we'll save that for another time.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Thanks so much, Ralph, for coming on with me today. I'm very, very grateful. What I love about the Jesus books that you've written, well, there's many things, but one thing is that when I read the books, I felt transported back into that era and into that history like no other book has kind of done so. So it was they're extremely well written books.
Well, thank you.
I just can't recommend them to people enough. So
well, I think perhaps, well, maybe you can tell me your views on this, but my view of why that might be so is because my books accord with the historical record, so you can actually transport yourself back into that era. Whereas if people are talking about this as a mythology, well, you can't do that. And if people are talking about this as just a spiritual, believe the books, again, you can't put yourself back into that era. Whereas my books are all to do with the personalities and kings and queens of that era. I don't know, was that why they seemed more real?
Definitely. I just remember I could literally, the way you wrote it, I could picture everything in my head. I remember you talking about the towers that people used to preach out of. I'm trying to remember what they're called now. And
the stylites.
That's it. Yeah, stylites. And I mean this with an awful lot of respect, but the whole scene kind of reminded me a little bit of Life of Brian. Because
yes.
all the films I've ever seen that picture kind of that era, Life of Brian is probably the most accurate.
and in many respects quite prophetic. I think the authors of that story didn't know exactly what I know, but they were running along similar parallel tracks.
Definitely.
And so you'll find lots. I use little bits of Life of Brian throughout my books, just to put it back into, current sort of culture that people can resonate with. What have the Romans ever done for us?
Yeah, definitely. Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Ralph. Thanks for coming on with me. It's been really, really interesting, and I hope to talk to you again very, very soon.
Pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you, Ralph. Please give us a like, share, and subscribe, people. And please try and get a hold of one of Ralph's books because they're absolutely brilliant. Okay, cheers, Ralph. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.